Good evening, everyone. My name is Christine Hong, and on behalf of the UC Santa Cruz Center for Racial Justice, I'd really like to warmly welcome you to tonight's event. I want to thank Visualizing Abolition and the African American Resource Center for co-sponsoring tonight's event. And I also just want to say that in the course of planning this event over the past, now it's been several months, many people were involved in the conversation, too numerous to thank here, but just thank you so much for your participation and input. Most critically, I also thank Stefan Jung, who has provided extraordinary support in the organizing of this event. I'd like to introduce tonight's facilitator, Gina Dent. Gina Dent is Associate Professor of Feminist Studies and is the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Humanities Division at UC Santa Cruz. Her most recent publication is Abolition, Feminism Now, which she co-authored with Angela Davis, Erica Miners, and Beth Ritchie. Alongside Rachel Nelson of the Institute of the Arts and Sciences, Gina Dent anchors Visualizing Abolition, a Mellon-funded public scholarship initiative that features art exhibitions, public events, artist commissions, a music series, postdoctoral fellowships, grad student workshops, as well as curriculum development. Gina.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you to the CRJ for arranging this incredibly important event. I'm very thrilled tonight to be able to share in a conversation with several people, one of whom is an exceptional leader on these questions and who has been one of the authors of the report we are going to be discussing tonight. So our event, Why California? The 2023 report on reparations for African Americans is an opportunity for us to discuss the ongoing project of reparations and the need to think about the past and the future in terms of what it will take to create a new just framework for our democracy. And so what I want to do now is tell you a little bit about our format. We are fortunate enough to have a special guest, Don Tamaki, I will introduce momentarily, and Don will be speaking to us for some minutes. And after he's finished, we have a distinguished panel that will be asking him some further questions, and Don will continue to answer those questions, and we'll also open at the end for audience questions. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion, and now I would like to introduce our panelists. Our first esteemed panelist is Don Tamaki. Appointed by Governor Newsom to serve on the California Reparations Task Force, Don Tamaki, senior counsel at the law firm Minami Tamaki and former executive director of the Asian Law Caucus, has a long record of work in reparatory justice. He served on the pro bono legal team that reopened the landmark Supreme Court case of Korematsu v. the United States, overturning Fred Korematsu's conviction for refusing imprisonment during the mass roundup and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. This critical work provided a key legal foundation in the decades-long Japanese American redress movement. He also co-founded StopRepeatingHistory.org, a campaign focused on drawing parallels between the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II and the targeting of minority groups based on race and religion. The campaign's current work focuses on the intersections between the Japanese American redress movement and the long struggle for African American reparations, with an emphasis on public awareness of the importance of advancing reparations for African Americans. Our other speakers, faculty at UC Santa Cruz, include Xavier Livermon, who is Associate Professor of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies and Director of Black Studies. He has published widely in the fields of African popular culture and African queer studies. His recent book, Kwaito Bodies, Remastering Space and Subjectivity in Post-Apartheid South Africa, discusses the rise of post-apartheid South African popular culture and its articulation with contemporary politics of race, gender, and sexuality. He is currently working on a project examining Black queer belonging in South Africa. Hiroshi Fukurai is professor of legal studies and sociology at UC Santa Cruz and the author or editor of 10 books and over 100 articles. One of his most recent books, co-authored with Richard Kruth, Original Nation Approaches to International Law, examines the rights of Indigenous peoples in the age of Anthropocene. In addition to Indigenous approaches to international law, his areas of research focus include lay adjudication and Asian law and politics. He teaches courses on international law and global justice, race and law, and colonialism and international law, among other topics. He served as past president of the Asian Law and Society Association. And finally, to return to Christine Hong, she chairs the Department of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies and directs the Center for Racial Justice at UC Santa Cruz. She also co-chairs the UC Ethnic Studies Faculty Council and the UC Area H Ethnic Studies Implementation Work Group. Her book, A Violent Peace, Race, Militarism, and Cultures of Democratization in Cold War Asia and the Pacific, was published by Stanford University Press in 2020. Along with Deanne Borchet-Lim, she co-directed the Legacies of the Korean War Oral History Project. She serves on the board of directors of the Korea Policy Institute, an independent research and educational institute, and co-edits the Critical Ethnic Studies Journal. So as you see, we have an incredible panel of speakers, and I'm thrilled now to turn over to Don Tamaki the mic so that he can share with us some information about the process of building this report and the work to come.
I really appreciate that long introduction. Too long, Professor Dent, thank you. And really appreciate Christine and Stefan and for organizing this event along with UC Santa Cruz. I approached this subject with humility. You know, I'm the only of a 9-member task force. I'm the only one who's not Black, and shall we say, my presence is conspicuous in like who's that little Asian old man photobombing the group task force picture, and so of course that would be me. And so I have drawn some parallels with Japanese American redress and reparations experience, but there are many differences, but there are some useful lessons as well. This is a pretty scholarly audience, so I'll try to refrain from reciting history that you all are steeped in and have studied, but just as a matter of framing, I think it is important particularly to discuss a bit about California history. So let me just begin by talking about the task force itself. So the murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020 triggered the largest protest in US history, as you know, calling for a racial reckoning, and propelled the legislature to pass less than 4 months later, AB 3121, creating the task force to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. The purpose of the task force is to, 1, document the harm of over 400 years of oppression, 2, recommend ways to educate the public of our findings, and 3, to develop reparations proposals, applying the UN standards for reparations, which are restitution, which is the return of property, for example, taken like Bruce's Beach in Manhattan, Manhattan Beach, compensation, obviously cash payments, rehabilitation, helping people to recover, like mental health programs, satisfaction, acknowledging the wrong and apologizing for it, and guarantees of non-repetition, which is to say, stopping continuing harm. So the task force convened in June of 2021, and 1 year later, fulfilled its first charge of publishing a sweeping, nearly 500-page interim report, drawing a through line from the harm of 246 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow racial terror and exclusion, and decades more of continuing discrimination, resulting in today's outcomes, which are at once shocking, but sadly not surprising. The report and the executive summary, which is 29 pages, easier to read than 500, is in the chat. So in March of 2022, in a 5-4 contentious vote, the task force determined that eligibility for monetary reparations should be limited to descendants of persons enslaved in America, thereby addressing one of the principles of reparations, which is compensation. Some of the disagreements centered around how easy or how difficult it would be to trace lineage through genealogy, DNA, or ancient records maintained by enslavers or the US Census. Some of the other concerns arose of how the task force honors one of the other pillars of reparations, which is guarantees of non-repetition, which is to stop the harm. So for example, in 2021, San Francisco Black infant mortality was 5 times that of white babies. With respect to policing, did Derek Chauvin care whether George Floyd was a descendant of an enslaved person in America or a Black immigrant? So many of these policy reforms necessary to stop these kinds of harms are not easily solved by tracing lineage. So those were some of the issues that the task force had to wrestle with. Nevertheless, on May 6th, the task force finalized proposals for repair corresponding to the subject areas of the harm identified in the 13 chapters of the interim report, which are things like the wealth gap, the administration of criminal justice, disparities in healthcare, education, housing, and so on. And the links to those reparations proposals are also in the chat. AB 3121 also required the task force to determine economic methodologies for calculating the harm. So to this end, we hired 4 economists to develop data-based methodologies in order to educate the public of the enormous economic extent and impact. And that's never been done before. I mean, we're doing this for the first time, folks. And so the economists said, well, in order to calculate the harm, we need data. And for much of the harm, as you know, there isn't any data. I mean, how do you economically value lynching? You know, the lives lost or lynching, or centuries of segregation in education. It's terrible, but it's harder to put a number. And so the economists focused on 5 areas, which are health harms. They felt that there was enough data there. Housing discrimination, mass incarceration and over-policing, unjust property takings, and devaluation of African-American businesses. And just based on those numbers, just to shine a light on the damages of that, I mean, it's astronomical. It is enormous. However, despite Fox News and other news media erroneously reporting that the task force has recommended a specific compensation of 1.2 million per individual or even billions, we did not recommend that the state pay any specific amount. We did recommend that the legislature has to address the issue of compensation, because that's one of the pillars of true reparations. But we did not recommend a specific amount. And one reason is because once a number is thrown out there, that's all anybody sees. That's what the media focuses on. And reparations is so much bigger than that, although that is very important. By far, most of the proposals involve policy reforms in healthcare, housing, education, employment, criminal justice, and other areas reflecting huge and growing disparities resulting from the cumulative, cascading, and compounding impact of racial discrimination. It is now up to the legislature to consider not just individual compensation, but the dozens of policy recommendations to stop the harm from continuing, and to determine a feasible approach spanning years to address harms that have been decades, if not centuries, in the making. So in short, the harm was long in the making. So the repairs need to be long in the implementation. This cannot be a one and done because the harm is so grievous and massive. So the task force will present the final report to the legislature on June 29, 2023. I expect that there will be national publicity as well as local on that. And after that submission, the task force will sunset. we will no longer exist. One of the questions posed by this program is why California? In fact, that's the name of this title of the program. So here's some history. Of course, you know, the Civil War ended in 1865, but about 5 minutes after Robert E. Lee surrendered, the South was determined to reinstate laws and ways as close to slavery as possible. And 200 years, the U.S. had built one of the largest and most profitable enslaved labor economies in the world. The enslaved population of the United States was 4 million, and cotton was the economic engine that powered the nation. The nation's constitution protected slavery and gave southern states outsized political power. Half the nation's pre-Civil War presidents were enslavers while in office, and more than 1,700 congressmen representing 37 states once enslaved Black people. So this is very deeply embedded in our culture from the very beginning. Once the culture of 1619 used race to dehumanize people to the level of pigs and goats, in the words of Martin Luther King, thingifying them, then the most heinous crimes against humanity could follow without a second thought. Following the end of slavery, this cultural norm, valuing white lives above all others, morphed into forms of hate that put a target on the backs of not just African Americans, but other people of color. I think simply put, if you could thingify Black people, then marginalizing any other disfavored group du jour is easy. Slavery begat the cultural foundation of America's racial hierarchy of white folks on top, Black and Native people on the bottom, and everybody else in between. And this was certainly manifest in California. We think of California as being a more enlightened state, but while California entered the Union in 1850 as a non-slave state, it was plenty complicit with the institution of slavery. And enslavers entering California in 1849 came in and they brought their human property with them. California's 1849 anti-slavery state constitution really meant little because it was not a crime to keep someone enslaved in California. From 1852 to 1855, the California Legislature passed fugitive slave laws, allowing anyone accused of escaping enslavement to be chased down, brought before a court, and sent back to the South, even though they had been living in the free state of California. In 1850, California banned African Americans from testifying against whites in court. 2 years later, the California Supreme Court likewise barred Chinese Americans from testifying against whites. The result, of course, whites could commit crimes against African and Chinese Americans with impunity. Democrats came to power in 1867 by promising white voters that they would fight against any new law that would make African Americans, Native people, or Chinese Americans equal to whites. And much of Jim Crow found its way into California. I thought I knew something about American history and California history. Turns out not even close. White supremacy groups flourished in the West. In the 1920s, California became known as a strong Klan state with a sizable and violent Klan resurgence emerging in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Oakland, Fresno, Riverside, Sacramento, Anaheim, and San Jose. Glendale, Pasadena, Culver City were sundown towns, excluding African Americans through laws, intimidation, or violence. When my parents were incarcerated in America's concentration camps, along with 120,000 other Americans of Japanese ancestry during World War II, merely because they happened to look like the enemy. The first place they were confined, along with the 8,000 or so Bay Area Japanese Americans, were the horse stalls at Tan Foran racetrack in San Bruno, turned into a temporary holding pen surrounded by barbed wire and machine gun towers, while 10 concentration camps were being constructed from California to Arkansas. They didn't miss the irony that the racetrack's restrooms and drinking fountains were segregated by signs reading white and color, indicative of how deeply Jim Crow had infected California. During much of the 20th century, federal, state, and local governments officials working with private individuals actively segregated American land into Black and white neighborhoods. California was a leader in racially restrictive covenants. By the 1940s, some 80% of the homes in Los Angeles had deed restrictions barring African American families from moving in. Between 1932 and 1962, 120 billion in federal loans helped create America's middle class, but 98% of those loans went to white families. In 1956, so-called urban renewal policies enabled San Francisco to condemn and tear down the Fillmore district, resulting in 20,000 Black residents being displaced, 883 Black-owned businesses destroyed. And 10 years later in San Francisco, Japantown, that was likely reduced from 44 blocks to 4, including a 4-flat immigrant hotel owned by my father's family, which was also taken by eminent domain. So when you align the redlining maps of the 1930s through the 1970s used by lenders to exclude African Americans from being able to get federally insured loans with today's maps of the most impoverished, underserved, and polluted neighborhoods, they align exactly. With respect to housing and education, America is as segregated today as it was in the 1940s. White households have 9 times more assets than Black households. The past essentially created the huge disparities that persist today. So America really needs to know a number of things. That reparations is not a handout. It is not welfare. It is a debt owed for stolen lives and stolen wages, land, and opportunities. America needs to know that the entire nation benefited from these unjust takings over the past 400 years, whether from enslavement, exclusion of African Americans from equal employment, the benefits of the New Deal, loans or other wealth transfers, or from separating America into devalued Black neighborhoods and enhanced value white neighborhoods. Moreover, this debt is a collective one, just as any other debt that the nation incurred years, decades, or even centuries ago, such as from wars, public works, natural disasters, social security payments to seniors, or reparations to others for wrongs that the government committed. And America needs to know that there are reparative programs that actually work, that change lives and thereby the systems and the culture that created the racial disparities in the first place. So yes, reparations does involve a check in the mail, but it also involves so much more. I mean, we're talking about a transformation of systems and culture. And this issue of history repeating itself based upon this racial pathology that began arguably in 1619, it just keeps recirculating, was quite obvious during the Trump years, when Asian Americans were blamed for the Chinese virus, when Mexicans were labeled as drug dealers and rapists, when Muslims were called terrorists, when LGBTQ people were demonized, when white supremacists declared that Jews and immigrants are poised to replace them, and certainly when one more African American among countless others was killed during an encounter with law enforcement. And it barely evoked a shrug because it was so normal. So the issue here now is, how do we move the needle of public opinion? We're going to sunset in literally, a month. And so how do we keep this momentum going? And that's one of the reasons for this program, is to appeal to the public, and particularly to higher education and those in academia and thought leaders in terms of how we do this. So certainly one way is an endorsement campaign that we started as part of this effort. And in the chat, there's a link to the website, supportreparations.org. It currently has 187 organizations, and they're bar associations, they're labor organizations, there are people in faith communities, social service organizations, civil rights advocates, and so on. And we intend to keep that group together. I'm hoping by the time we submit the final report on June 29th that it will be grown to 300. And this is a daunting task that's going to take many years, but at the same time, this discussion about reparations is, I've never in my lifetime ever seen it at this level. And so the hope is that we begin to penetrate the mainstream in California, and we need to do that. Black people are 6% of California's population, 14% of the country. Nothing is going to happen unless we reach that mass in the middle. And to the extent that California can achieve some measure of success, as it begins to there are dozens of reparations proposals, but if they can begin to be implemented over time, I think it will catch the attention of the state and other states, and ultimately, hopefully, percolate up to Congress, which up until now hasn't shown even the political will to study reparations, let alone do anything about it. So I'm going to stop here, and I just want to thank you for allowing me to, do this presentation to you.
Thank you so much, Don, for that. And I would like to just quickly turn to Christine to begin.
Yes, I just wanted to reiterate what I typed in the chat, which is I see a ton of academics in the house. If you are in a department, you can consider proposing to the other members of your department that the department also offer its endorsement. That's within our purview and power to do so. So I wanted to say, Don, and I welcome the comments of the other participants on this roundtable. Your appointment by Governor Newsom really enables us to think about the importance of multiracial solidarity behind struggles for reparations. You have done extraordinary pro bono work on the Korematsu case, and you were explicitly chosen by Governor Newsom because of your work doing your long commitments to reparatory justice. And part of this has also been your involvement along with the descendants of Fred Korematsu, Gordon Hirabayashi, Minoru Yasui, in the organization Stop Repeating History. And I wanted to ask you about the work of that organization, which is linked to your work on this task force. In the vacating of the criminal convictions of Korematsu, Hirabayashi, and Yasui, there was something that was left intact. And so as part of the redress struggle, these infamous cases were vacated, yet your organization itself demonstrates that the war that was waged abroad against Japan in the middle part of the 20th century and domestically against Japanese Americans left a kind of structure intact, and that was a structure of expanded war powers. And your organization, we could see this in, for example, the legacy of George Bush's war on terror, and also what Stop Repeating History identifies as Trump's executive overreach. And I wanted to ask you about, I don't necessarily want to revisit the model minoritization of Asian Americans, except to note, and I think that most people here know this, that in the 1960s, Japanese Americans were identified as a model minority as part of an explicitly divide and conquer politics. It was a kind of wedge ideology that held out as incomparable Japanese Americans as succeeding without any kind of recourse, specifically without any recourse to the state. And I wonder about the 1980s and the redress struggle and the 1988 Civil Rights Act, and whether or not there was some element about the approach to redress that left to the side the violence of US war and police power. Insofar as there was this perception that it was one and done, and those people who are wronged were made whole, it left the expansion of US war powers to the side. And there was a broad perception that monetary damages were sufficient to the task. And in fact, you can see in, for example, former House Representative Mike Honda's HR 121, it was the Comfort Woman legislation. And in his support of his co-authorship of this bill, Honda wrote an op-ed in 2015 in Time magazine, and he called on Abe Shinzo to formally apologize for Imperial Japan's system of militarized sexual slavery. And he referenced the history of the camps, the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans. And he said, our government made a mistake, but they apologized for it and healed many wounds as a result. Japan must do the same. It must show the maturity of a democratic country, apologize for its mistake, and thereby gain the trust of her sister Asian nations. And I wonder if there is something about this account of redress that is worth revisiting, and how the kind of broad structural vision of reparations that galvanizes the work of the task force has exceeded precisely that kind of logic of one and done. And this is not to compare the respective histories, but it's to compare the political approach. And so if you could speak to that, I would really appreciate that. And I want to also say something, that there is this comparative historical imagination that animates claims for and politics behind reparations, also turns on a critique of the violence, the racial violence of capitalism. And it's not just, and I want to say something here. I hope you don't mind my actually referencing Frantz Fanon, but Frantz Fanon in Wretched of the Earth actually, states that the wealth of imperial countries is our wealth too. He essentially states that Europe is the creation of the third world. And he said, therefore, he said, nationhood is only moral reparations. He said, if there's ever aid given from Europe and the West, or the global North to the global South, he said, the logic should just be, this is just reparations. Okay, it's just reparations. And I was wondering about whether or not, let me just say this. How do reparations enable us to begin to think through the multi-directional violence of racial capitalism? And the logic here is not just like the kind of common one, like Germany paid, so what about like the United States? But more pointedly, and this is what Robin Kelly, the historian, writes, he says that reparations are part always of a broad-based strategy to envision ways to radically transform society, including by redistributing wealth, creating a democratic and caring public culture, and exposing the ways that capitalism and slavery produced massive inequality. And so I just wanted to, just raise that for you.
Is that for me?
Yeah. You don't have to take it up.
You've given me a lot to think about. I'm
Yeah.
going to give you a thinking out loud answer, but I also want to save time for the other speakers to chime in here without getting too deeply into it. Just random thoughts here. There are things about the Japanese American redress and reparations movement which was successful, particularly in educating the public of what happened. And we did rewrite that history. I mean, it was largely viewed as a mistake, and something the government shouldn't have done. But we now know it wasn't a mistake. It was an intentional manipulation of lies and fabrications in order to manipulate the outcome of a major Supreme Court decision to validate this whole thing. It was the collapse of all three branches of government. And so it did repeat itself. I mean, notwithstanding what we did and what promises we made to Fred Korematsu that we would, if win or lose, we would educate the public about what happened. It repeated itself in Trump versus Hawaii. So in the Muslim ban, although Chief Justice John Roberts, in a 5-4 decision, condemned Korematsu versus the United States as being, wrong from the day it was decided. Good for him that he did that. In the same breath, he upheld the Muslim ban, saying that, by the way, that's got nothing to do with what happened to Japanese Americans. And just reaffirmed basically the exercise of presidential power and the fact that the court wouldn't question it. So Korematsu, the worst, most dangerous aspects, that if the government declares you to be dangerous, you can be locked up without trial, without evidence, nothing. That was imported into a new vessel, which is now Trump versus Hawaii. So we didn't fix that, and so history does repeat itself. I think the other things that you looped in about the themes of capitalism and what motive, the slave trade and colonialism were obviously driven by profit. It was profitable to turn people into property. And so those values sort of have continued to churn through the centuries. And what started as enslavement and colonialism sort of have morphed into other forms. It became profitable to devalue Black neighborhoods and enhance the value of white neighborhoods, to put polluting industries in one quarter of a city and then keep the other area pristine, to drive freeways, through disadvantaged communities. We're 2,500 eminent domain projects in the United States, 991 cities, 1 million people displaced, 80% of those people were Black. It was a profitable thing. And today's concentration of wealth should give everybody pause. In 2001, a married husband and wife could transfer $675,000 of assets tax-free. That estate tax exemption has swelled in 2023 to $26 million. And it is just one example that's eye-popping, but it's a small example. There's huge concentrations of wealth in America. So when we look into the issue of reparations, of course, on the surface, we are talking about, very importantly, about specific injuries to specific people, but this bigger question of this pathology in systems just continuing to churn and re-victimize people over and over again and getting worse is the bigger subject. And so, but unpacking this, shining a light on it shines a light on the whole thing. So some of that, are lessons learned from the Japanese American experience, but others, despite what we did, just continue to roll on. I think the main thing, though, is to educate the public of what happened. Like I said, I thought I knew something about American history. Not even close. Really. In fact, that most of the American public, the Washington Post, New York Times have done stories on Tulsa and Greenwood. And this happened 100 years ago. We're just learning about it now. But in the report, history is littered with Greenwoods. It's not like it was the only one. And so I think the first part of change begins with telling the truth. And so I don't know if that's answered your question, but just my comments.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that's a important transition to asking Hiroshi if you would share a few thoughts with us.
I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Don. And for the short time I have, I would like to inquire into the possibility of reparations to descendants of enslaved Africans beyond the 19th century United States. Recent research by prominent African-American professor Gerald Horn at the University of Houston has revealed that the many enslaved Africans who came to California around the mid-1800s, before and during the frenzy gold rush era, were brought by Texas enslavers. In the same period, California politicians, including Peter Burnett, the first governor of the state of California, issued his executive orders to exterminate California Indians and open up the indigenous ancestral homelands for slavery and further exploitation. And the California government paid $1.5 million on that extermination effort. And Texas, from which many enslavers came, was once a sovereign and independent state called the Republic of Texas from 1836 to 1845. In 1836, Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston, and other Euro-American enslavers who migrated to Mexico in the early 19th century decided to declare independence from Mexico because second Mexican president, Vincent Guerrero, who was of African ancestry, abolished slavery in 1829. So after its independence, the Republic of Texas became the major international slave trader, especially in Cuba and Brazil. Even after 1865, American enslavers from the US South, including Texas, played the prominent role in kidnapping and trading the Melanesians and the Polynesians in the Pacific to Queensland, Australia, and other European colonies by setting up the business port and business base in the Fijis and other Pacific islands. Australia was once English colony, and like those in North America and the Caribbean, under the jurisdiction of the English monarchy. It is interesting to note that 2 weeks ago, as a head of the English monarchy, the Prince Charles was coronated and became the King of England. It is also important to recognize the wealth of the House of Windsor of English monarchy was largely built upon the sacrifice and exploitation of enslaved Africans in their colonies in Australia, North America, Caribbean, and around the globe. Today, former English colonies in the Caribbean, such as Jamaica and Barbados, who later became the independent states, but remain as part of the British Commonwealth, expressed their desire to secede from the Crown and initiate the discussions of reparations to the descendants of enslaved Africans in their countries. In the Caribbean, England took over control of Jamaica from Spain in 1655, leading to the major production of sugar, creating so-called sugar boom that further promoted England's wealth accumulation. The English monarchy also helped create the Royal African Company in 1672 and promoted the transatlantic slave trade. And Jamaica became the key role, played a key role in the major development of England's slave trade, first financed by the English monarchy, and after 1688, when the constitutional monarchy was established, and so-called the Glorious Revolution had allowed the English merchants and private powers to take over the slave trade, making England the global economic and military power by the end of 17th century. And today, under the bill AB 3121, the California reparation only extends to the descendants of enslaved Africans in the 19th century US. And as a member of California Reparation Task Force, and who voted not to limit the reparation to the descendants of enslaved Africans in the 19th century US. And I wonder if you, Don, could kindly speak about the possibility of extending the reparation to other US states, as well as possibly beyond the US borders, especially England and European countries' reparation responsibility to descendants of Africans and other victims of European colonialism, which has been extended throughout the globe. Thank you.
Unmute. I'll try to be really brief on this, which means I won't answer your question, Professor Fukurai. exactly, but I'll just think out loud with you what happened. I mean, we're dealing with the limits of the legislation, which required us to stay within certain limits. And we're talking about descendants of American slavery. The very title talks about with special emphasis for persons enslaved in the United States. So, you know, there are 12 million people kidnapped from Africa. 2 million died in the Middle Passage. 400,000 gets dropped off during this period of time in North America. And the rest end up in Brazil, Caribbean, Haiti, and different other places. 10% of African Americans are immigrants or descendants of immigrants. And so there was this and then what are the limits of anti-Black hatred, you know? And a lot of, there was a lot of argument about things that are not based upon descendancy as much as anti-Blackness. And so it was a big controversy. In any event, the task force voted to limit it. And, you know, all reparations movement at one time or another, for whatever practical reasons, right or wrong, do limit things. In our Japanese American redress and reparations movement, all these Peruvian Japanese that got kidnapped and end up in American concentration camps were completely cut out until, you know, and never really made whole, to even to the extent of the other American, so-called American Japanese Americans. And if you died in the camps, or if you died before the bill passed, you got nothing. Your estates got nothing. So out of 120,000 people incarcerated, 80,000 people got checks. And so I'm not saying that to justify what the task force did, but it's just line drawing. And so that's certainly one thing. And then the most ardent reparationists, you know, some basically argued that if Black immigrants who were, and some of these countries have traditions of enslavement as bad or even worse than America. But the argument was, go to the Queen of England, you know, go to Portugal, go to Spain for your reparations. Don't take our reparations. So this was a political dynamic that the task force was in the middle of. And I think it came out with an acceptable alternative. And that is to say, even though I was on the losing side of that particular vote, I do believe that a class of injured, unacknowledged population needs to be recognized. And to the extent that if there are monetary compensation, and that's for the legislature to decide, they need to be acknowledged for that. On the other hand, the policy recommendations are not so limited to lineage. I mean, how do you do some of these things like healthcare reform by tracing lineage? It's really is a practical matter. If you were going to do a health policy experts, and you'd say, you know, we're not going to say we're only concerned about descendant Black babies in San Francisco and not the overall Black infant mortality rate, or Black women, regardless of education or income, have 3 to 5 times pregnancy complications and mortality than the rest of all other ethnic groups. And so are we going to say, you know, we're only concerned about descendant Black, you know, pregnant women? So there were those kind of things that we just had to wrestle with. And I do think, though, that if California has some success here, it will encourage other states, other countries to look into this, to answer your question. But, you know, there's no good answer to this. Like I said, I don't believe that Derek Chauvin cared whether Floyd was an immigrant, a Black immigrant, or a descendant of an enslaved person. I think the only thing that mattered to him was he was Black. But at the same time, I also believe that if we have an opportunity to provide some monetary atonement to an harmed class that remains unacknowledged, I think we should do that. And there is, and I realize, having gone through this, how many sides to this story there are, but there is a sense among folks that African American folks that Black Americans opened the door on civil rights and fought these struggles, and everybody else walked through that door. And if you look at the metrics in California, every metric that matters. Now, I'm not saying that Asian Americans, particularly Hmong immigrants and some of the others, or Latinos, or certainly Native people and all of that, they're both on the bottom. I mean, Black people and Native people are on the bottom of that metric scale, period. And others here and there, but the one constant is, and persistent, is those two classes of people. So I think that was another driver to sort of make the reparations specific. Doesn't answer your question, or even the moral one, but there was a practical sort of approach that was taken, for better or worse.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to turn now to Xavier.
Hi, I was really struck by when I was looking through some of the executive summaries, the discussion about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. These have been, programs that have been followed traditionally in Global South communities, where some forms. I know I think there was one in was it Peru or Bolivia? I can't remember exactly. I'm sorry about that. But South Africa had one. And I think there was a lot of, I think the outcome of that has been mixed in many different ways, because in the South African case, I think there was this sense that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission put the information out there. So there was no way to kind of deny the various different forms of dislocation that were present, the various different forms of harm that came out of the apartheid regime. And of course, how 400 years basically of colonialism preceding, or 300 plus years of colonialism preceding the apartheid regime's establishment. And I'm interested in that piece because while I definitely think that I definitely agree with the critiques of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and worry about its sort of wholesale adoption as a kind of form of reparation without any other kinds of forms of reparation around economic justice. I would say that some of the debates that we're currently having in this country around ethnic studies curriculum, around advanced placement in African American studies in Florida, around these book bans and these sort of, anti quote unquote woke bills and all of this, right, seem to really be, to me, deeply connected to the creation of a fantasy, a white supremacist fantasy, for lack of a better word, of what the history of the United States is. And it seems to me that I'm really interested in the Truth and Reconciliation component of reparations, because it seems to me that it provides a space for us as to really be able to talk about this truth of our history as a nation. We can obviously start at the state level in California, but it seems to me that there are implications for this outside of our state. And I want to just also add that I also learned so much, reading just the executive summary. There were things that I didn't know about Californian history in relationship to the forms of harm, and I always had associated those things with Southern states and didn't realize that a lot of these things were actually happening in California. And so I think that for me, I'm really fascinated in the idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because it does the work, I think, of not allowing folks to sort of easily dismiss things that have happened. And I think that if I have a question for you, I think the question would be following alongside that. What roles do you envision our educational institutions having in relationship to educating the public about the bill? And I think in many ways, pushing back against the sort of misrepresentations that I think are going to be a part of the way that this bill is discussed in mainstream media. So I really would love to get
Well,
your
I can make a
how.
plea. I can make a plea to you, actually, Professor, on this, and I really appreciate the question. I mean, my plea is this: that there's a narrative that is dominant, and it's not. It's age old here, and that is slavery happened a long time ago. People who are enslavers are long dead. People who are enslaved were dead, and civil rights bills were passed in 64 and 65. The playing field is level. If you try hard, you can make it. And if you don't make it, it's your own damn fault. And so the outcome of that narrative is reparations is being claimed by an undeserving minority that's looking for a handout, a grieved minority. And to do so would just be to disable them in some ways. It's kind of a Larry Elder, argument. And so, in 37 states nationwide, either bills have been passed or pending regulating how teachers teach history. I mean, it's like a replay of the 1925 Scopes trial, when the teaching of science was criminalized, basically. And so this denialism, following the Civil War in the South, being determined to reinstate the old ways, and the mythology of that came out of that was the war wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights and the North dominating. I mean, that's a constant thread here. And so California is going the other way. Well, some of these states are looking to suppress and rewrite history and deny it and erase it. California, thankfully, is going the other way. So I think we need the teachers, the thought leaders out there writing op-ed pieces, teaching about this, and so on. We'll be hiring, we've hired 2 UC Berkeley School of Education professors to start working to transform the interim report into curriculum for high school students. But we need more than that. We need people to I don't know how many people read these days, frankly, And so if we could turn the interim report into dramatic works, or into documentaries or 15-second TikToks, whatever it takes to basically start getting the message out there. And no social movement's going to go anywhere without an intellectual foundation. And everyone that's been lasting has had a intellectual foundation. Who developed that? The thought leaders, behind that. So, in essence, we're trying to build a movement here. And my plea is that the academicians, the professors, really get involved in this and start writing about it, start talking about it, start pushing back in big and small ways, and begin to help get the conversation out into the mainstream. And that did happen, during the civil rights movement in my lifetime. Of course, we were galvanized by when we watched George Wallace, saying segregation now, segregation forever, in the present, segregation forever. And then, peaceful demonstrators and young people being set upon by dogs and beaten with clubs. But it was the intellectual underpinnings of that, Martin Luther King being, one of the principal thought leaders to articulate, otherwise really complicated, or issues that could be made complicated, into something people really understood as a justice issue. not just something of an aggrieved minority, but something that goes to who we think we are as Americans, who we aspire to be. And so that kind of stuff really has to be done by thought leaders. So, you know, truth and reconciliation is part of that. I mean, there's this debate as to what among the dozens of proposals amount to true reparations. And some are maybe reparations and some may be just good policy, you know. But nevertheless, it's in there. But I do know that simply saying, I'm sorry, and here's $1, now we're done, go away, is not going to get it done. In terms of that pillar of reparations called satisfaction, it's got to be meaningful atonement of some, you know, and shining a light, telling the truth is part of it, but there's got to be more to it to make it meaningful.
Thank you so much for that, Don. And I want to pick up on a couple of the threads. You know, you mentioned that for this word to get out and for things to shift in the public, we need to, as faculty, devote our energies toward educational materials, but then you also referred to the problem that maybe people don't read in the same way. I certainly would say as a professor that I'm always hoping that we are teaching people to read again. And I think one way that people would be engaged in reading again is to be able to read something that feels meaningful to them and seems to match the struggles that they are actually engaged with. And of course, that's the work that we all on this panel are hoping to be involved in through our lives. I'm coming here also as someone who's been involved in prison abolition work for a very long time, from well before anyone would have said that in public. And I know very much about what it means to be attacked for being unrealistic, for suggesting something that would create further violence. And I hear you already raising how many of those charges have been launched against other kinds of reparations efforts, and that you anticipate, of course, in this case, we will have the same. I have to say, however, having studied the report carefully now and having listened to you, that it's very clear that the report has done many things that are quite exceptional. One, certainly, and you've laid all of this out for us, the level of research that's gone into trying to figure out how large and in what ways we could shift the outcomes as you've narrated, especially for Black and Native people. But you also have really told us about something that makes me think a lot about the 19th century. Xavier was referring not only to truth and reconciliation, but I think also to transitional justice. And those are often opportunities internationally that we think of where there's a new government in place, there's something that has happened that makes it possible to rethink the very framework for what the society is going to be invested in and how the state is going to be structured. And I was thinking very much along the lines of what W. Du Bois wrote, and despite the counter-revolution of property, or even what you referred to about the civil rights era in terms of others who, in fact, have been the beneficiaries of what was developed during the civil rights era, the turn to thinking about Reconstruction in the 19th century is an invitation also to think about how much actually was built up that has been an advantage for many. And of course, this introduces questions of class and a complexity of multiracial existence that I think the report sets us up to actually respond to with some very strong claims. The report doesn't just, as you point out, create some kind of monetary recompense for those who descended from US slavery, but also sets up a kind of foundational set of structures that would allow us to reimagine healthcare, education, and so many other institutions from the ground up. And of course, take on the criminal legal system in a very serious way. And so I wonder, maybe in the interest of trying to help people to understand how much we all have to gain from this project, if you might actually speak to those larger ambitions and the idea that this might actually be grounded in reparations for US slavery, but that, and California's role in that, but that also it's really about rebuilding a society from the ground up.
No question. I mean, I did not have this view before I started this thing, but the deeper we got into it, the more I realized that just by studying it deeply, it unpacks the whole, I call it pathology. Other people call it systems, culture, and how things are the way they are. I mean, the lesson of the Japanese American redress and reparations and our family's incarceration was pretty clear to us that if the culture says lock them up, facts don't matter, the law doesn't matter, the Constitution doesn't matter. I mean, it was normal to do that and expected, and so this goes to changing culture, and from culture come laws and systems and everything else. And so I think that was revealing to me how deeply reparations is. It's not just fixing things on the surface. It's kind of relooking at everything. So and it's very daunting, but you got to start somewhere. And then we've experienced this in our own lifetime, how things can shift. And how many years ago? Not too long, actually. Marriage equality was forbidden in California, and the velocity of that change is pretty remarkable. So I think there are some things that can change, and I've seen change, but it's got to be very deep, and we need a different approach on this. I'm just hoping that this, to be honest with you, I can't tell yet whether we're on the verge of something historic, or this is another effort that might be forgotten within a year or two. Now, there are reasons that make me believe it won't be, that this time it will be different. But it does depend upon getting other people involved in this, and particularly the academic community. So just a comment, Professor Dent, to your comment, that I agree with you, how deep and impactful just looking at the reparations is. It's not just a question of correcting historic wrongs. It's really going in there and sort of looking at everything.
Yeah, I want to thank you for that. And I also think it's an opportunity for us to say to not only students, but I'll just refer to students here, to all students, how much they have to gain. And we think about this moment when there's so much despair amongst our students, even those who are activists and who are engaged in trying to dream for a better world. But there's a sense that it's all too much, and that without a dramatic change of direction, that there really is no future for them. And I feel like we have to deal with that every day. And I appreciate the report so much. And I appreciate it especially because, having gone into it initially, when I knew what it was about and have been involved in these conversations in the past, I felt like we needed to raise questions of indigeneity, questions of what happens with conquest, and not thinking even in terms of the language of property. But the report is so rich in the way that it actually helps us to reconceptualize all of the various kinds of ways that we are in relation to each other. And so I want to thank you for the depth of that work. And I think it's time now actually to open on to some of the audience questions. So I am going to be pulling them up in the chat. And I am going, I think what I'll do is read the two that I have before me now. Would it be easier, Don, for me to give you one at a time?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So the first one comes from our colleague Naya Jones, who writes, "I'm appreciating how Professor Fukurai's question questions the nation state and acknowledges complex transnational histories. As Livermon and other panelists are noting, the report and process are revealing histories. Thinking of movements, I wonder how this reparations work in California might extend, and this I think you've been asked in a way, but it's going to be asked again in another way, might extend to Canada and Mexico, or connect with efforts, movements already underway there, especially as nations so often envisioned as sites of Black freedom, but that have long histories of anti-Blackness, erasure, enslavement of their own Black communities.
Again, you know, these questions, you know, go way beyond my pay grade, my expertise. But I can tell you in the link that goes to the proposals, there's a chapter on international reparations that goes into Canada, you know, and the boarding schools, and South Africa, and Native people, and even things like Tuskegee and eugenics, sterilizations, and, you know, those sort of things. And it's helpful just to see what's gone on in other countries, you know, Peru, and, you know, disappeared people, and, you know, how other populations have dealt with that. And the purpose of including those 50 pages is to say, you know, America's got to get with it. You know, this section on Germany's payments to Israel for the Holocaust. And this is not preposterous. This is something that other countries have done to reconcile with their own past. And so, and I think, you know, any success here will also encourage justice efforts in other countries. I know the Japanese American Redress and Reparations had a big impact on Japanese Canadians. They were also rounded up and put in concentration camps. And so one impacts the other. I have a more modest, you know, to me, it's still a huge deal, but I'm not thinking globally. I'm thinking, okay, how can we influence what's going on in Evanston, Providence, Rhode Island, and in Georgia, and other states that are just having at least locales thinking about truth and reconciliation. And then ultimately, how can we get this into Congress, before Congress? You know, the Civil Liberties Act for us passed in 1988, providing for reparations. And it was really a two-part, there were two bills. There was a 1980 bill, which just said, we're going to set up a commission to study this, to see what happened to Japanese Americans. And that was followed 8 years later by a money bill. And so Conyers in 1989, 1 year later, proposes HR 40, right? And it was the study bill. You know, let's study reparations. And for the next almost 40 years, very few co-sponsors. There are now 200. He's gone. You know, it's been taken up by others, Sheila Jackson Lee, but, you know, it hasn't even gotten to a floor vote. I mean, Congress doesn't even want to study this, let alone do anything about it. So my hope is that we can influence this process, so at least we can begin to shine a light, get the national government to shine a light on nationally where the harm began in the first place. And this state effort is not the preferred route, in my humble opinion, but nothing's happening on the congressional level. Nothing's going to happen the way the House and Senate are constituted. So California's gone ahead, and we're hoping to create momentum that way. But ultimately, I'm hoping to impact, you know, the rest of the country.
Yeah, that's wonderful. The next question, I think, will require you to go back to some of what you already said to us in terms of the non-individualistic way in which this model of reparations has been constructed. But I'm going to ask it and invite you to expand again on what you have already taught us. This comes from Sister Paula Livers Powell. You know, has there been any movement for or criteria for eligibility or a timeline for receipt of reparations, and in what form?
Yeah, so this is questions that we're getting all the time, and the answer is the legislature. It's a punt to the legislature to figure that out. Part of it is that we're pedaling as fast as we can, and we're going out of business on July 1. And so it was quite a lift just to get to where we are in terms of shaping these proposals. But to turn this into legislation in which the legislature, it's an appropriation bill, basically, and then the determination of how to figure it out. There is a proposal for a Freedmen's Bureau that would be staffed to help people trace lineage and this sort of thing. And there's huge mechanics involved here. And none of it is in place. So what I want to emphasize is that this is just the beginning of a process. And the proposals that we've come up with are not the be all end all. I mean, there are the public and advocates out there that who might say we're wrong. We should have done this, or we should have proposed that, or they have better approaches, or they want to augment, what we've proposed. So all of that would begin in the commencement of a legislative process. Senator Bradford, Stephen Bradford, and Assemblyman Reggie Jones Sawyer are on the task force. They know that they have a heavy burden of taking what we've done here and then introducing it to the legislature and getting co-sponsors to put this together. But the putting together part, the sausage making, would be the next step. And that is, it would have to normally go through a legislative process in committee and before analysts and other things, and hearings before the public to get input. So all of those questions at that point would need to be addressed, but they're not addressed now, is the answer.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful because it's important to demystify the legislative process. I think people really don't fundamentally understand that or know that, and you've been so helpful at laying some of that out for us and explaining what a long road there will be. But I also want to point out to our audience that when you see the report or see the recommendations, you'll see that so much of what is in the report suggests ongoing study, so that this study is not just to result in a set of legislative solutions for the current moment, but really, as Christine was emphasizing earlier, a way to continue launching that work. I'm going to read another comment or question from our audience. I think this one will require you to go back to thinking about some of the questions that have come up earlier in terms of the selection of Black people from a larger multiracial society. So this one is from Jamie Hindery. If we are trying to build a movement for reparations, might it be a better focus to build a broader movement for pan-racial economic revolution? What are your thoughts about the concept of reparations operating within a system of racial and gendered capitalism? It's a thick question.
This is probably, I just don't have enough expertise to answer this intelligently. I can only go to the practical limitations of what we faced with. And I get this question all the time. It's like, and in fact, I get emails saying, I'm not for this because it leaves out Native people, it leaves out Latinx, it leaves out other oppressed groups. And so this legislation was specifically for this specific harm group that has not been acknowledged. And so, I can't say that precedent is precedent, that once you create something, then it opens the possibility for it to be expanded. But it's a huge, huge endeavor. I mean, we're dealing with something that America has nobody wants to talk about this in our whole history of the country. And in fact, they've denied it. There's a famous quote by Malcolm X in the report that basically says, if I stick a knife in your back and I pull it out halfway, that's not reparations. If I pull out the knife but leave the wound agape, that's not reparations. And unless you do something more to fix it, it's not reparations. And we're in a state where people deny that even the wound exists. He said that in the 1960s. That's exactly right. So to basically say, okay, we're going to also add the wounds of other people that have been oppressed, continues to make it a big daunting project even bigger. So, you know, that there's no good answer to that, but the only one I could say is it's focused. And having been through one movement, Japanese American redress and reparations, of course we got the same thing, you know, from Black African Americans. Although the Congressional Black Caucus and congressmen like Dellums and Dimely supported our efforts, Yvonne Braithwaite Burke and others, there are plenty of people that said, look, you know, why should you get reparations when we haven't gotten ours yet? And so, you know, that's an argument, right? I mean, and you know, we're facing that now too. But I think we need to stay the course and get this done. Treat it as a precedent, understanding that each time America has owned up his wrongs, admitted them, and embarked on fixing it, the nation gets stronger. And then it also creates a precedent to fix the other wrongs. That's not necessarily satisfying for other groups that are equally hurting, but this is where we are with the task force.
Well, and it does also, I think, remind, I think, scholars of a principle of thinking from below. The data that you've shared with us and the report elaborates on really does suggest that there's a reason. You've given many of statistics today that tell us why we should be concerned for this particular population, not only for that population, but for the entire society. And so, you know, it's one of the scholarly habits that, you know, many of us learn early on, is that you try to look to the bottom and see that. And if you address that, then you are able, obviously, to lift all. So I think it is really important for us to be able to recognize that and to communicate that. And you've done such an exceptional job of doing this work and also allowing us to see that with you. I'm wondering if, I think we may have time for one more question. So if there's anyone who wants to raise their hand and be unmuted or called on, please let me know. I don't yet see any hands. But if there is anyone who's holding on to a question that would like to ask it, I can call on you now. And if not, we have one more technical question, which I don't think you're going to be able to answer for the reasons you've already laid out, but I'll read it since it was sent to us. It comes from Julian Hall. Would those who were born and raised in California, but have since moved out of state, be eligible, assuming they can prove lineage to someone enslaved?
The answer, at least in terms of our recommendations, is yes. And so the harm is based upon the methodology proposed by the economists, but then there's an also overlay of residency. And if, for example, during the period of the harm, and let's take housing, the economists measured from 1850, when the state entered the Union, to the official end of redlining. If a African American who can trace their lineage at least to 1900, lived in California his or her entire lifetime, then that would be a different number. It would be a bigger number than if someone was living for a year, 2 or 3, 4 or 5 years and then left California. But that period of time where they were resident, domiciled in California, would be a basis for a claim. So that's the way the recommendation and the methodology is set up. And so when the press comes out and says, well, you know, the number is this, they've done some modeling with numbers, you know, based upon the methodology. But you wouldn't know until you individualize the claim to how long people were living in California, you know, whether they're still here, whether they moved out. what was the extent of the impact. So it's an imperfect way to calculate damages, but it is a method. We thought it was logical. And if people are forced out of California because California is too expensive to live, if they lived in an African-American neighborhood that was destroyed by eminent domain and they had to move back to Texas or whatever, that should be recognized. But there should be a calculation for those who were forced out of, say, Russell City, which is part of Hayward in California. That city, African-American neighborhood, was destroyed completely, and people became renters in East Oakland, never to own property again. And so that's a different number. It's a bigger number than people that have moved out.
Thank you so much for detailing that, and also for all of what's in the report that also suggests that not only will individual compensation be part of the package, but rather that systems will be redesigned to support those who are encountering healthcare and education and other ways, so that it's so important to think about what else would be shifted all around us. I want to thank you so much for your time. I want to thank the panel for your exceptional attention and your knowledge and questions. And I want to thank everyone for attending and remind all of us that really what we're here to do is to learn more about the report, about the work, and also to use our own voices to lift up this work and to continue to make it possible for it to move to the next phase in the legislature. It's on us to share out this work, to get our organizations to make endorsements, to help educate the public, and therefore we need to educate ourselves. And so this is just a small part of what we need to do to make that happen. So I want to thank CRJ. I want to thank you, Don Tamaki, so much for your time. And I want to thank our panelists, Christine Hong, Hiroshi Fukurai, and Xavier Livermon. And thank you all for being here today.